want to welcome you all this afternoon, and I'm Joyce Garnett. I'm the University Librarian here at Western, and I'm also an instructor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, shaping future librarians, and hoping, I don't see any of my students here. Oh, hi, yes, hello, okay, extra points. In terms of exposure to the ideas that are circulating in the research community that are so important to the future of libraries and the future of scholarship. I want to thank Adrian Ho and his colleagues for organizing today's event. This is one of two events that are scheduled for Open Access Week here at Western in order to celebrate and promote the open access movement. And Adrian has been with us since last September and has made remarkable progress in spreading the word on campus about alternative scholarly communication vehicles and also about the value of open access. He's also identified champions on campus for open access, and we have three of them with us today who will talk about their own perspective on open access related to their research, which is, in terms of their areas of research, is a very broad spectrum of interest. With open, and I'm sure actually you're probably preaching to the converted or almost converted in terms of those who've shown up today, but just a reminder that open access, the ideal open access environment is one in which there are no barriers to the dissemination of knowledge. So no financial barriers, no physical barriers, no technical barriers, no geographic barriers, no social or political barriers. Now that's in the best of all possible worlds, and we're still on that journey towards that wonderful world. And when I think about it, life is a journey, not a destination, so we should enjoy that journey as we go along. So talking about process for this afternoon, I'll be introducing all three of the speakers in the order in which they will speak, and they'll speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes each, and Adrian is the keeper of the time clock and will be flashing threatening signs, and so the speakers will curtail their remarks to within that particular time period, because it's very easy to go on when you're so passionate and enthusiastic about a subject, which is mental note to myself, don't say too much right now, Joyce. Followed by the three presentations will be the opportunity for open forum in terms of questions and comments to pose to our panelists, the panelists of your choice or all panelists who are present. And so in order of speaking, we have Joaquin Madrenas, who would like to be known as Kim, who will speak on the benefits of open access from the scholar's perspective. And Kim holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Immunobiology, is a professor in the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry and head of immunology at the Robarts Research Institute. He has an MD from the University of Barcelona and a PhD in immunology from the University of Alberta. In terms of research, he's published extensively in high-end prestige journals and has received numerous awards for his research. In terms of his contributions to teaching, he's an active teacher of immunology and again has received many awards for his teaching. For service, he has served as a reviewer for national and international funding agencies and institutional boards. He's also actively engaged in public education and community outreach in science and history. And I would like to apologize to Kim for really compressing and coalescing the very extensive and impressive biography that he sent to me, but in the interest of time, I didn't put all the words down that I might have. Our next speaker is Ajit Pyati from the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, who will speak on the benefits of open access from the social perspective. Ajit is an assistant professor in films here at Western. His MLIS and PhD degrees are from the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. He actively publishes and does research in the areas of information policy, international library development, globalization and immigration studies, and information and communication technologies for development. He's currently conducting a major grant-funded research program in India focused on issues of equitable information access and democratic participation in India's so-called knowledge society. And our third speaker will be Mark Perry from the Faculty of Law, who will speak on what academic authors need to do in order to reap the benefits of open access. Now, with apologies to Mark, who may indeed have sent me his bio and it may be lost in my email, but as I put down here, I couldn't resist, that Mark is so busy traveling internationally and publishing in open access journals and open access books to provide a bio. But here's what I gleaned from Western's website. Mark is a faculty member in the Faculty of Law in the Department of Computer Science. He serves as the Associate Dean for Research, Graduate Studies, and Operations in the Faculty of Law. He has an LLB from Manchester and is a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada. His research interests are focused on the intersection of law and technology. So I'll turn the podium over to the first of our speakers.
I'd like to thank Adrian and his colleagues for inviting me to participate in today's session. People from my faculty usually do not come to this end of campus, but I guess it's true that saying that sooner or later you have to meet with a lawyer, and that is what happened to me today. So I'm going to give you just an overview of how scientists working in the field of biological sciences or medical sciences feel about open access, what they have to go through, and what are some of the things that could be improved regarding that. Let me start just showing you these.
In the year 2003, the Public Library of Science made it possible for people all over the world to have access to the latest scientific discoveries. Shortly thereafter, things began to change.
This is a pretty good pitch for open access publishing in the biological sciences. What I think is perhaps a key feature of this video is that in fact the concept started about 10 to 12 years before. It took 10 to 12 years before to actually get the concept of open access publishing, get some champions, and actually get some users. And to me, the champion was this fellow, Harold Varmus, born in 1939, Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1989 for discovering the viruses that actually, or some viruses that are able to cause cancer. And in 1993, he was director of the NIH, a position he occupied until 1999. I was tremendously fortunate to work under him at the NIH, and I had the opportunity to be exposed to this evolving concept at that time of open access publishing. In the year 2000, he left the NIH and moved to become president of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. And he certainly is credited with moving the field of open access publishing fast forward. He is a co-founder and currently chairman of the board of directors of the Public Library of Science, one of the main non-profit public open access publisher, and is also member of the board of trustees of Biomed Central, that is one for-profit publisher of open access material. So what is open access? Just to make sure that we are talking the same language, here you have a very wordy legal type of definition of open access by PLOS, by the Public Library of Science, is any publication that meets these two conditions. One is that the author and the copyright holder grants to all users a free, irrevocable, worldwide, perpetual rights of access to and a license to copy, use, distribute, transmit, and display the work publicly, and to make any and distribute derivative works in any digital medium for any responsible purpose, subject to proper attribution of authorship, as well as the right to make small numbers of printed copies for their personal use. Relatively lengthy definition of one of the conditions, just to say that it means that you are able to freely access it and use it for scholarly purposes. And the second condition is that a complete version of the work and all supplemental materials supporting that work, including a copy of the permission, as stated in the first condition, should be in a suitable standard electronic format, deposited immediately upon initial publication in at least one online repository that is supported by an academic institution, by a scholarly society, by a government agency, or other well-established organizations that seek to enable open access, unrestricted distribution, interoperability, and long-term archiving. tremendously long definition, probably to say that is just that publication that offers free availability and unrestricted use to a scholarly material consented by the copyright holder. I think that would be a much easy to handle definition for discussions or for fora like today's. Open access very often refers and occurs in the context of the World Wide Web. So that probably becomes one of the potential barriers to accessibility to open access, having access to the World Wide Web. And there are variations based on the restrictions that you may encounter when you are trying to access and or use the material posted. The most freely available open access involves what is called the gold open access. So it's not only a fully open access journal that publishes, but also allows you to access that and make it available without barriers. There is a hybrid open access model in which the accessibility is correlates with the payment made on behalf of the author, either by himself or by the institutions or by the funding organizations of the work being published. There is a delayed open access situation in which what happens is that everything is postponed a period of time, a period of embargo, after which the accessibility kicks in. And finally, there is a green open access. It's a type of access in which self-archiving, deposited by its authors of the material, occurs independently of the publication part that has occurred previously under the non-open access conditions usually. What are the major open access publishers? This is a key thing to keep in mind because this is what researchers need to know in order to start deciding whether an open access journal certainly provides an advantage for him or her to publish the research that has been done. Well, certainly the one that seems to stand up as the most preeminent non-for-profit organization providing open access publications is the Public Library of Science, PLOS. Okay? Currently, it defines itself as a non-profit organization of scientists and physicians that are committed to making world scientific and medical literature a freely available public resource. To me, in my opinion, this is the gold standard open access model that scientists should look at, and we will see it's certainly the one it's permeated more strongly within the scientific community. Then you have the Biomed Central platform, another major open access publishing platform, in which they define themselves as a science, technology, and medicine publisher that has pioneered the open access publishing model, currently with 202 open access journals and publications. Then there are others. Here I mentioned two others. Bentham Science Publishers, a major STM publisher, with 92 online print journals and 200 plus open access journals and related print and online book series. And the Indawi Publishing Corporation, similar to that, increasing number of journals for these publishers. What I like to mention to you is that even though the Public Library of Medicine started in the Western Hemisphere, in North America, we are starting to see the sprawling and the flourishing of a lot of open access publishers whose main central office is actually located in developing countries, be Middle East or being in the Far East. Here, the two examples I mentioned, Bentham and Hindawi. One is in the Emirates, United Emirates, and the other is in Egypt. They try to have also an office in North America, but primarily the mail that you get, the mail as a researcher that you get promoting the publication within their journals is actually mail that seems to have originated in the central office in these developing countries. Interesting thing to keep in mind. So what has PLOS done since 2003? Well, it has come with 7 open access journals, and those are known as PLOS Biology, PLOS Medicine, PLOS Pathogens, PLOS Computational Biology, PLOS Genetics, PLOS One, and PLOS neglected tropical diseases. Of these 7 journals, 6 have already been able to enter into the indexing with impact factors that are respectable. 1 has not. But I can tell you that the one that has not is certainly starting to get a lot of credibility in the open access community, even though it has not received yet an impact factor. Okay? That one is PLOS 1. So you will see a lot of news in the science world that actually make reference to PLOS 1 papers, even though they do not have an impact factor, so we don't know their real, actually, penetrance in the scientific community. Biomed Central, as I said, has 202 open access peer-reviewed journals that cover a lot of different disciplines. Here are some of the ones that I am particularly interested, or some that caught my attention. They have a BMC Immunology, for example, BMC Medicine, BMC Genetics, but they also have a journal of negative results in biomedicine. Okay? So as you can see, whenever there is a niche, there will be somebody that will make a journal. I remember hearing from some very respectable scientists that if you get tired of your papers being rejected, you start your own journal, right? So the open access is actually giving you the opportunity. Now, I think that a close look at impact factors from these open access journals will get you an idea of how well they are doing. So, as I said, the PLOS, in my opinion, is the gold standard. Look at the impact factors. What I would call impact factors that are above 5 would be high impact factors. So you have PLOS Biology with an impact factor of 12, PLOS Medicine with an impact factor of 12, and PLOS Pathogens with an impact factor of 9. The others certainly have much lower impact factors, 5, 4. And if you go to the BMC journals, you start to see really a drop in impact factors. These are of the higher end of impact factors for BMC, Biomed Central Open Access journals. In fact, there are a lot that are either not indexed or they get impact factors of 1 at best. And if you go to the Indawi or to the Bentham, you start to see most of them still waiting for an impact factor. Having said that, another way to look at this data is to say, well, how well these journals are ranked within specific fields of science. Then what we see is that in the 2008 journal citation reports by Thomson Reuters, there were 5 open access journals that had the highest impact factors in their respective fields. And those were neglected tropical diseases, pathogens, computational biology, PLOS Biology, and then this Journal of Medical Internet Research that was not within PLOS, I believe is from the Biomed Central. Now, let me tell you that I believe that this data is pointing to the idea that we are looking at encountering a niche for these open factors journals. If you want to get a full directory of open access journals, please go to this webpage and you can find all those. Now, one thing is to publish in an open access journal and hope that the journal, if it's a gold open access journal, will take care of the publication as well as the archiving. The other is to go and rely on the archiving from somewhere else, hopefully the institution or a government-based organization. I believe that in the future we will start seeing other ways to archive, and those other ways may involve personal web pages, blogs, wikis, you name it. And it's going to be interesting to see how these can be regulated. Specific archives that I consider essential, well, the scholarship at Western should be our first stop, and PubMed Central, in my opinion, is the one that will consolidate archiving for most scientific community. Myths of open access. That is not copyrighted. That's nonsense. I believe that the speakers after me will touch this. That is non-peer review. Not at all. Most open access that have been indexed have stringent peer review conditions. That they are useless for career advancement. Not at all. PLOS journals are as valid as any other high impact factor journals to be considered in promotion and tenure processes. Lack of prestige, equal arguments. Printless, no, you can basically get that. and that there is no preservation or that they are free of revenue. That's, again, not at all the case. We can discuss that later on. Advantages of open access publishing, well, in my opinion, is the exposure that you can get, the dissemination, and the speed that you can get in disseminating those results. The interactivity and the ability to track down the access is something that I would not underestimate, because Biomed Central, for example, has already a platform that allows you to track down how many times your paper has been accessed and at what rate it is being accessed, allowing also readers to have a comment or to post comments on your paper, something that for the non-open access journals, you have to rely on a section, letters to the editor, that is either non-available in most journals, or if it is severely screened out. Potential shortcomings of open access, I think the lower impact, certainly we start to see a lot of journals sprawling, we probably will start to get a lot of journals that are never read, and that will bring the overall impact of open access low. The cost, I'll show you what you can expect. And in terms of misinformation, this may be valid only during the time in which the posted version is not the actual corrected version. The cost has to be distributed by many different sources. We can discuss these, and for the sake of time, I'm going to skip it. But here you have an example that affected us recently. This is a paper submitted to BMC. Before it goes to review, you have to identify yourself as coming from an institution. In my case, I came from UWO. So they check whether UWO is a member, a sponsor of BMC. And if it is, then you get a rebate. But even with the rebate, we are looking at about $1,500 US per paper if it gets accepted. So it's not it's not a small peanuts amount. The bottom line is, if you, so yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was wanting to ask about the impact analysis you keep referring to.
Yeah.
How is that scored?
Okay, so do you want me to answer now or later on?
Maybe we can save the questions to later.
Okay. So I'm going to finish up, and allow me to just these 2 minutes to make this point. I believe that the issue is not to convince librarians nor to convince university administrators that open access is an option. The issue here is to convince the end user that they have to use open access as a qualitatively important advancement in the world of publication. And the only way to do that is to put a carrot stick approach. And that is what the NIH has done, and I think is what CIHR has done. You get a grant from CIHR, here you have the outlines, or from NIH, you have to make your results available, and you have to make your results available in open access form, either by publishing in an open access journal or by making sure that the papers are posted in an open access archive. What does it mean? Certainly, if you can get a paper in Nature, Science, Cell, New England Journal of Medicine, go for it. That is the gold standard. I am the first one that I'm going to do that. However, I also need to make sure that I comply with the regulations of the journal, as well as I look at open access as a viable option. At the NIH, the same as CIHR, currently any author that is getting peer review funding and is publishing results as a result of that peer review funding has to put the publication in an open access vehicle, and that is either, in an open access journal or in an open access archive. If you are not sure whether this is available for specific journals, there is a database that lists all the legal requirements as best updated as possible. I think that is something we can discuss. And certainly you will see that there is an easy coding in terms of color, so that you can see what type of coding, what type of responsibility you have in making sure that your research becomes accessible, openly accessible. How to decide? And that's my last slide. Well, always researchers should go for the highest profile exposure to the work they are reporting. So be open access or not be open access is a secondary issue at this point. You need the highest exposure. Having said that, Once you get that highest exposure, there is always a way to get open access, and that it will be either by publishing in open access journals that are of high profile, or by getting your work in an open access archive, be institutional or be international repositories. In my opinion, PubMed Central is the best one that we have available. For nothing else, I put this cartoon to make sure that we understand what we are talking about. If we are the ones that read the papers, and we are the ones that review the papers, why should we pay to basically do all this, when in fact we should be getting this for free? I don't get a penny for writing the papers for Nature, Nature Medicine, or Immunity. I don't get a penny for reviewing for those journals. The logical thing is that I should be able to read papers in those journals at least for free, and that doesn't happen.
Thank you again to Joyce and especially Adrian for having us here and promoting and discussing a very important issue, because open access is not something that is merely a scholarly or academic issue. I mean, it really is about more, as the term implies, open access, access to knowledge, and particularly scholarly knowledge for the advancement of knowledge, right? Because knowledge needs knowledge to advance. But it also has various social benefits, and I want to talk about that a little bit. I've done a little bit of work in this area. I teach, as Joyce mentioned, in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies here at Western, and part of one of the programs I work in is Library Information Science. So I'm also teaching, even at the moment, future librarians. I have one of my students also in this class. So we interface with these issues as part of our disciplinary practice as well. So it's a pleasure for me to talk about these issues. So having said that, what I want to talk about in the brief time I have here is I want to frame open access also in terms of the wider economic context in which scholarly knowledge production gets created. And in particular, I want to talk about the so-called scholarly publication crisis, which is a real crisis. I don't mean so-called in a pejorative sense, but it certainly is. And how that sets up the context for the importance of open access initiatives. And I also want to talk about open access, again, in its social benefits to wider society, beyond the academy, and then also talk about it in an international context. I also do some research internationally, not necessarily on open access issues, but I'll bring up a little bit of example of the work that I do in the context of India and why something like open access would be extremely useful, not just for my research, but for disseminating that research to research partners and interested parties that may not be able to access the information through proprietary databases. So the scholarly publication crisis is a moment in time which we're still living through to a certain degree that really reached its peak in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s and into the 2000s, where the price of licensing, purchasing journals, but increasingly licensing of electronic journals became prohibitively expensive for many academic libraries to manage. And it was an issue in the sense, if you look at the numbers, I used to have them on slides, and I can't give you, I don't want to misquote any numbers here, but it was increasing at such a rate of increase in the price of these journals that was far outstripping inflation increases. So it was quite an exponential, literally, rise in prices. So as journals are moving to the electronic environment, many academic libraries had to cut subscriptions to print journals and drastically make a lot of reductions in their collections decisions. So to illustrate this point, in the case of Elsevier, publisher, and earlier case in the earlier part of this decade with the University of California system, there was a lot of pushback with the pricing of the journals from Elsevier, and we're talking about licensing costs of millions of dollars. And the University of California system was able to come together as well as other systems to negotiate that price down. So it was a small victory, but it illustrated the power of, I'll use the word cartel, maybe that has a negative connotation, but these publishing cartels, where increasingly we're seeing in the publishing market, as in many other places in the world, in media as well, with media consolidation, we're seeing a lot of consolidation in these publishing companies where fewer and fewer companies are controlling more and more of the market. So if you're on the access side of the issue and the library side of the issue, that's a problem, right, in terms of negotiating prices. So certainly the concentration of academic publishers and this monopoly over scholarly knowledge production is a major issue. And part of that as well, and I'm a scholar, I'm someone who thinks about some of the wider political and economic contexts, and to me, to make sense of the issue, we have to think about the increasing commodification of information and knowledge. When I mean commodification, the increasing input and of the market of buying and selling of information, which has been increasing in various domains. And I mentioned media. We're seeing an increase in media concentration, but in general, when we talk about the information economy, we talk about that a lot, but part of the information economy is an expansion of intellectual property rights, expansion of copyright over various domains. They're tending to be more restrictive and actually in the favor of less access rather than more access. So given some of that context, the open access movement had some openings to try to influence the discourse towards less focusing on restricting access, but trying to make access to knowledge more open. So part of this crisis, as I mentioned in the previous slide, it was a pricing crisis in terms of purchasing materials, but increasingly with licensing, it's a crisis about permissions as well. And what makes scholarly publishing different and scholarly knowledge in general is that there's something called a vanity factor in academic publishing. And unlike other forms of say, cultural information, whether it's music, television, et cetera, or videos, in general, the profit model, and as Professor Madrenas had mentioned, that we don't make money as scholars in general. We're not making money off of each individual article that we publish, for instance. That it's great that we have jobs in this economy, but we're getting paid, sometimes very nice salaries to do intellectual work. And part of what we do is create scholarly knowledge and disseminate that. So part of our reputation as John Walensky, who's a scholar in open access issues, and he's written a book called The Access Principle. And my next slide has the reference to that book and a quote from that book. But Walensky mentions this vanity factor, and really for academics and for those involved in this type of knowledge production, it's really about the more people who have access to your work, your reputation will grow. So it's not vanity in the negative sense, but vanity in the sense that the more people who have access, the greater the impact of your work, potentially. So related to that, there's a social impact of research and knowledge dissemination. As I mentioned earlier, access to knowledge can have various implications in society in terms of creating new knowledge, new innovation, and also, as I'll talk towards the end of my little segment here, on the international context, increasingly with increases in health, growths in economic growth as well. So there's a lot of factors to keep in mind. And what changes in technology, it's self-evident now, but in even just a decade ago was unclear in terms of how the internet was developing. In the previous age in publishing, there was a bottleneck. One would say it wasn't an artificial bottleneck, but it would look like an artificial bottleneck today where just the limit of a print run, right? If you have a journal disseminating that, the idea of open access was still very limited. I mean, it could be highly subsidized, but even then, you're still limited by the material capabilities of whatever it is, the printing press, distribution system. But the internet, thinking of it as this kind of massive digital printing press in a way, a lot of these bottlenecks have been eliminated. And there are certainly bottlenecks we may create artificially in order to create some sort of profit models on the internet, right? It doesn't, obviously, as we know, it's not, everything's not free to access. It costs money to create certain forms of knowledge and information. But we're seeing the case where more people can have access, as long as you have access to a decent internet connection to get access to this information. So changes in technology have been important. And as I mentioned too, the financial incentives in scholarly publishing are quite different than in other realms of knowledge production. And this is the quote from that book, The Access Principle, from John Walensky. And this is how he characterizes the access principle. It's a commitment to the value and quality of research carries with it a responsibility to extend the circulation of this work as far as possible, and ideally to all who are interested in it and all who might profit by it. In a basic sense, again, this idea that knowledge grows by having access to knowledge, right? That sharing knowledge is something that we can talk about some very basic, going back in time, Enlightenment principles about having access, informed citizenry, a knowledgeable citizenry. But all these issues are important and are interrelated. And it was mentioned earlier in the previous talk about different types of open access. I won't talk about that in great detail, but there are things such as institutional repositories, which is being set up by Adrian right now here at Western, open access journals, self-archiving, delayed open access, and policies on publicly funded research such as the CIHR policy and the NIH policy. So in thinking about benefits of open access, or their drawbacks and challenges, and I'll briefly cover these issues right now, but I think it's probably more fruitful if we have this discussion in the Q&A. Is it incompatible with peer review? Certainly not. Right? There are many open access journals and other forms, especially open access journals, which certainly have peer review. As a graduate student at UCLA in our department, in our graduate school, I edited a journal that was open access, but had a very standard and very good peer review system. So certainly it's very, very possible, and it's happening as we speak. And is it free to access? Well, it'll depend, right? There are different models, but certainly there's a push to try to make the barriers to access as limited as possible. And with the incentive issue for faculty, Professor Madrenas had discussed the issues of impact factors. That's still a concern, and I think that was news to me I wasn't following Public Library of Science as closely, and to see that the impact factors for a number of journals that are high is promising. But still, again, as you mentioned, for faculty, especially in my position as an untenured faculty member in my third year now here, still my incentive is to publish in the high impact journals, which tend to be, in my field, not open access, which is ironic given that in our field, the impact factor and citation indexing and all this and open access are important things. It's an interesting paradox, so we should work on. But still, one could argue as well that beyond thinking about impact factor, that if you have a publicly available article that's available on the internet, I've published in a few articles, about 3 articles in a journal called First Monday, which is a peer-reviewed journal on the internet, one of the first that came out, looks at internet and technology issues broadly, information issues in society. And when I Google my name and sometimes to see, where are people talking about me and that moment of academic vanity, I see the First Monday articles come up quite regularly. And there's one article that I published that has had, I think, a far-reaching impact compared to if I'd published it in a closed access journal or a delayed access format. So that's an example where we can think of the impact factor in a different way. Okay, so I will speed up here and talk about the gist of what I want to get across here in my few minutes, is to think about open access in an international context. We have to think about the social justice component of it as well. And importantly for access for scholars and students and users in the global south, I use the term global south. I don't like the words third world, developed, developing countries. What are we developing towards? What is developed? Are we developed? So that's my political stance on that. We can talk about that later or not. Increasingly, it's important, and we see the majority of scholarly knowledge production is still based in the global north, and by the global north, North America, Western Europe, you can think of the G8 countries, and tend to be dominated certainly by English language. There are other languages as well, but certainly some would argue that by creating more venues for access and also vehicles for open access, which I'll talk about in a second, for scholars and others in the global south, we can actually create a more democratic knowledge commons, right? We can create a more potentially collaborative environment and create more global knowledge exchanges, both between the North and the South, right, between the South and the North. There's scholars in the South that need channels to disseminate their research, and also South-South exchanges between different countries in the global South. And just to talk about, I guess, the research that I'm doing, I'll talk about that briefly here. I'm doing a project in India where I'm looking at, specifically I'm looking at public and community libraries and how they could be improved to meet some basic human development needs in certain regions of India. And I'm developing a network of interested actors, collaborators, colleagues. And I've already published a couple of articles out of that research, and one I just published in First Monday, the journal I mentioned. But the reason I chose First Monday, other than maybe a higher impact factor journal within my field, is that I really wanted my colleagues and the people who are interested, who are actually going to benefit from this research, to have access to it. That's crucially important. And there is a bit of a trade-off. I will probably have to parcel some of that research to go into the higher impact journal. But getting it out was more of a priority for me than the benefits maybe to my own promotion, though it will help me. It's not a low impact factor journal, but certainly not the highest. And again, so social benefits in the sense of creation of new knowledge, new discoveries, potential progress in health, economic development, and increased global sharing of knowledge and cooperation. And just a few, there's just some links, and I can leave these slides with Adrian. They can be put up somewhere. People can explore these. Already the Public Library of Science has been discussed. There's a directory of open access journals that is a very useful link to find different OA journals available. These are some more links. Electronic Information for Libraries is a program. While not necessarily open access per se, they negotiate favorable licenses for electronic journals for various libraries in developing countries. These other programs, Hinari and Agora, are UN-based programs that are working with publishers to get highly subsidized to more or less open access to a number of publications in these various fields. So there's a lot of things happening. And before I conclude, I want to mention the Public Knowledge Project. I had done some work during my dissertation time with this group, and they're based out of both Simon Fraser University Library, Stanford University, and the University of British Columbia. So there's a strong Canadian component. In fact, the software was developed in Canada, and what it is, it's they create a product called Open Journal Systems, which is actually an open source journal publishing platform. So anybody with the server space to do so can go to this site, which is actually hosted by a library, Simon Fraser University Library, an academic library that's out there on the front lines being active in this issue, not just for promoting access to knowledge for other scholars, but in a wider global sense. So you can download the software. In fact, there's been a huge worldwide uptake in Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, parts of North America, and they claim on their website that there's over 250 electronic journals in Africa using open journal systems. Think about that. And there's a lot of language customizability now. Tens and tens of languages can be used with the software. Now, these journals can or can't be made open access. It'll depend on the editors and the publishers of those journals. But it tends to be amenable to an open access format. It's electronic, and as long as you can download the journal, you can create your own journal, and it's much cheaper than before. So in conclusion then, leadership on the issue is important, and the point of mandates was brought up earlier, so I won't talk about it in detail. Federal mandates, things like CAHR and the NIH rules in terms of publishing and open access for publicly funded research. And I think increasingly too, a good point was made earlier about demand from users, but I think increasingly demand from students and scholars, while some of it's there, we need to increase that. I think that we need to be educated about the issues, and we really need to get our students involved too, because students actually think about change. Think about it from the 60s, 70s, think about student movements, right? Students are the ones. Professors, I mean, yeah, we can initiate and advocate for things, but if the students want it, then sometimes administration listens. I mean, sometimes they crush them, but sometimes they listen. And university mandates. I mean, there can be things called open access universities. If you look at the case of MIT, now I'm not saying this is a perfect model. I haven't studied it in depth. I mean, if people have issues with mandating that every scholar, every professor, every a researcher at that university has to archive in the repository of that institution is one way to go. And on face value, that sounds good to me, but certainly there's some issues. And it says my time's up, so I will go 30 seconds over that and just pose this question here. Now, can we have an open access university? I'm not saying either way, yes or no, but it's a provocative question to think about. And not only just in terms of positioning ourselves within academia, but if we're thinking about the importance of internationalization in UWO and our strategic plan for internationalization, what kind of message would that send if we had a university that really promoted open access and had as much of the material produced by scholars here at this university open to the world? So with that, I will conclude, and thank you for your time.
Thanks for Joyce, and very much thanks to Adrian for getting this scene together today. So I'm not quite sure I wasn't quite sure what I was going to talk about, because I wasn't quite sure who was going to be here. So I actually had various sets of slides depending on what I was going to talk about. So this seems the appropriate set, because some of what I say probably is a little bit challenging to what my colleagues said here, although I agree with them in spirit and in heart. I agree totally with what they were saying. So I also have to make a disclaimer. I'm talking here as Mark Perry, not a member of the university administration. So don't quote me in an administration context. So I'm going to address, first of all, a little bit about policy, a little bit about copyright, a little bit about licensing, repositories, and I really want to say something a little bit about patents as well, because that is also an open access issue, although, of course, universities don't really like to talk about that, and I'll explain why in a minute. So we have to sort of step back and think about, public research organizations, not just universities, but other publicly funded research organizations like this one here. And what is the role of these organizations? What do the researchers in the organizations want to do? Why you need to care a little bit about intellectual property, and how you're going to deal with your product, your output product of your intellectual activities, which of course usually is some kind of publication, invention, a widget, a method, a process, a plant, who knows. It could be all sorts of stuff, because between us all, we all do some really wonderful, exciting and interesting stuff. We also need to think a little bit about the role that universities are being sought to take in today's society. I suppose traditionally, or at least the last couple of hundred years, if you go back further, then things were different again, and perhaps we're moving in waves in historical context. But traditionally now, at least, we're thinking about universities being part of the public conscience, doing public good. We're doing good stuff. We're supporting society. And part of that is that academics have to be separate from the influences of business, government, which is why you have, tenure and academic freedom, and also the idea of open dissemination. Well, that is not really a new concept, because, the traditional, if you talk to any scientist who's over 45, what they did was they shared their results as soon as they could with as many people as they could, because they wanted to work with more people, they wanted their work to have an impact, they wanted to get feedback on their work, they also wanted to get validation that their work actually worked, which is also a very important thing in science. The same was not, the same story is true not only in science, but also in other disciplines like law, like social sciences and so forth. People wanted to get the stuff out there because they wanted it to be used. So despite the fact that our university is now supporting scholarship at Western, you might note, of course, that they're only dealing with materials that faculty own. It's not materials that the university owns, which is an interesting counterpoint, I suppose. And that's because the trend in PROs and universities is to protect and then license. They want to grab the stuff, capsulate it, and then license it out in order to gain income, is the propaganda, at least. What they're really hoping for is to be one of those 5 or 6 universities in the world that actually make money out of their tech transfer because they hit some patent jackpot. Typically, it doesn't happen. If you look at the statistics, I have the statistics, it doesn't happen. Tech transfer offices cost us money. There's no two ways about that. That's just the norm. The other trend, I suppose, is the trend towards being a service institution. You're servicing students rather than sort of lifting the shackles of ignorance from them, the veil of ignorance or whatnot. And of course, to get towards this trend of commercialization of PROs, then you have to put fetters on a number of things, such as the ability to do what you will with your work. So we have to ask, I suppose, what do researchers want as well? If you're doing research, what do you want? Well, you want to have the freedom to do the research you want to do. That's probably the main thing. But also you need some funding. Typically, you need funding to support students. If you're running a lab, it's going to cost you at least a couple of $1,000s a month just for, chemicals that you use for experiments and stuff. And I suppose there is all that crass stuff, fame and maybe some fortune and adulation, promotion, tenure. For some people who haven't got it, it's cost a bit of a tough thing. But the main thing is that we're driven by fostering our own ideas and our own imagination to do wonderful and hopefully useful stuff for society. I think that's the bottom line. So if we keep that in the background, the changing mode, I suppose, of commercialization of PROs at universities and other public research organizations, but also the fundamental drive still, I think, of most faculty that they want to explore interesting and exciting areas because it's a good thing to do. That's what grips them, that's what drives them. The other thing we need to talk about just a little bit, because if you read, there's no confusion today, but if you read some of the literature about open source software especially, or open access materials, then you'll see people throw in intellectual property rights as being the sort of evil overlord that's at the bottom of all the troubles in the world for making stuff open. Of course, that's not true at all. The nature of intellectual property rights is that you are creating an artificial scarcity in something that is not scarce, i.e. information, and why you do that is to foster dissemination, to reward innovation, to incentivize innovation and creativity, and also there's some other sociological, you're protecting the inherent nature of people that's expressed through their works and so forth. All that jurisprudential stuff that you can read elsewhere. But the fundamental nature of intellectual property rights is that you're creating a shell around something that really is not in its normal state bound. And you're doing that perhaps to make money out of it, but the main reason I see it is to enable and encourage dissemination of what's inside the shell. Otherwise, maybe it will go nowhere, or maybe it wouldn't be created in the first place. So we have to keep that in our minds when we're thinking about intellectual property rights, licensing, which is really the big pitfall with open access, and of course what universities, science faculty, and social sciences and humanities faculties too are trying to do with their works. So keeping all that in mind, as I'm sure you are, let's just think a little bit about copyright, which mostly people have been talking about today. We haven't really had any discussion on patents. I'm sure all of you know, or maybe you don't know, that everything that's an original creation, if you're sitting here doodling away, you instantly have copyright protection. So if you write an article, you instantly have copyright protection. It doesn't matter what you do, if it's an original creation, then you have copyright protection in it. The other norm is, inside the legislation, is that the employer will, in fact, own that copyright if you're employed by someone. But inside universities, I'm not sure about some other PROs, the author of the work keeps, through our collective agreements and historical, it just was the norm that inside universities, authors of work tend to keep the rights in their works. So here you are, you've got your copyright in your latest creation on a piece of paper. What do you do with it? This is a particular problem for younger faculty members, and particularly in the sciences. I think actually it's a little bit easier in the social sciences, but in the physical sciences and natural sciences, it's a little bit harder. And I'll give you an example of this in my computer science area, for example, in a minute, an engineering area. But publishers typically want you to give them everything. And until very recently, they really wanted everything. That you gave them the copyright, you had to assign the copyright, or they wouldn't publish it, and that was it. They were the only publisher. You didn't have any options. Maybe you could make photocopies for your class if you asked them very nicely, but that was about it. They have shifted and pulled back a little bit from that, that kind of approach, and they do give usually a license after you've assigned them copyright to put your material on a university or your institution or your employer's server, as well as your own server perhaps, and use it for your classes. That's what you might call a green publishers. There's a nice list of gold standard publishers, open access journals. There's a database there, I think that was mentioned before. So a slightly evil example is IEEE, which if you're in engineering or computer science or any of those kind of sciences, you will have publications in an IEEE journal or conference. Conference papers in computer science is probably the #1 means of disseminating material. They have 2 million documents in their library. These libraries are used a lot. They're certainly in computer science and also in engineering. This is where the latest and greatest peer-reviewed, because it's all peer-reviewed before it goes for accepted. Usually, most conferences, only about 25% of the papers are accepted. That's where the latest cutting-edge material will be found. Journals, they're too slow, typically. Even the online ones are a bit slow. This is where the cutting-edge computer science lives, in the IEEE journal database, or the ACM, Association of Computing Machinery database, which also has another bunch. That's a lot of stuff in there. They have a copyright policy. They will not publish your paper. In other words, it won't get into the conference unless you assign copyright up front. That's it. That's their rule. To shift them from that is going to take institutional effort. If I write to them and say, hey, IEEE, stuff for you, I'm not going to give you copyright. I like to keep my copyright because I'm a open access kind of guy. They will say, thank you very much for your letter, but we're not going to publish your article. For me, it doesn't really matter that much, but for someone who's not tenured, actually, that's a big setback. They have to basically get their stuff out. They have to get the lines on the CV. They have to get the peer-reviewed publications. So they have to assign their copyright to the publisher.
Is IEEE open access? Is IEEE open access?
No. It is not open access. The university pays, I don't know how much you pay, Joyce would know, a bundle of dollars, someone would know.
$7,000 a year might do it.
7?
70.
70? Not open access. Yeah, well, it's 2 million documents. Per document's pretty cheap.
That's cheap.
That's cheap. Yeah, that's a cheap one. That's a cheap deal. That's the mates rate. However, they do allow you, in exchange for giving up all your rights over the work. In other words, they license back to you the ability to do certain things. So, for example, you can post IEEE copyrighted material on your own server without permission, or on your employer's server, providing you should note there's the IEEE copyright notice, which is described in their rules somewhere. This material is presented to ensure timely dissemination of scholarly and technical work. Copyright and all rights therein are retained by the authors or other copyright holders, namely IEEE. All persons copying information are expected to adhere to the terms and constraints invoked by the copyright, blah, blah, blah. Which means that IEEE will not allow people to further disseminate once they download from your local server. There is another extreme, the really nice publishers, such as Irwin Law. I have an example here, a chapter of a book I did. The whole book is available online, Creative Commons license. You'll hear that talked about a lot in different places. which is not a bad license, not great. Different types of licenses, you can choose from one of 6. And it is an example of a publisher changing. This is a huge change for these guys. This is a commercial publisher that is basically saying, okay, we're going to print the book as normal. We'll need some subvention in order to run the presses, typically about $5,000 a book, which is not bad. And then we will also put the material up online for people to download as long as they're not using it for a commercial purpose. Well, that's not bad. I think those guys have, moved to being white hat publishers. So what can we do in order to move more publishers into a white hat situation? Well, I suppose, as I say, individuals, they don't care. We need institutional efforts on our behalf to move publishers into a open access kind of scenario. They won't listen to individuals. In Australia, it's way ahead of us. Universities there, like MIT, have been mandating, several of them, that faculty put all of the materials in a local archive. And the universities are negotiating with all the Australian and some overseas publishers to make sure that they do not assign copyright. They just give the publishers a license. They can do this because, for example, at QUT, they keep the copyright in all the works. It's not to make money out of it, it's just to ensure dissemination. That would be, something of a cloud of discussion, I know, here, because people think they'll be giving away something that's terribly valuable. So if you want to look at something, have a look at this, oaklaw.qut.edu.au. I spent my sabbatical actually working down there on an open access project, and they've produced a number of reports, 1 or 2 I've co-authored, that are all about open access and how we can make things happen. The other thing, I suppose, that we haven't really thought about is perhaps this publishing model, which is all we're doing is moving the traditional pyramidal model where we have the publisher and the authors and the readers down the bottom there. We're just moving that to an electronic medium. Perhaps that's not really the way things are going to happen at all. Perhaps we're all going to be Wikipedia publishers. If you really want people to read your work, you don't stick it in a journal, you stick it on Wikipedia. Maybe, everyone's going to look first in Wikipedia to see if someone knows about, cellular diversions in chaperone molecules, whatever. They're not going to look in the journals first, particularly if they're locked up in some publisher's database or in a university, unless there's a good search mechanism to go around the universities and find those materials. If you really want to get noticed, get your stuff into Wikipedia. You can put references at the bottom to your university's website, and then people will probably go there. This is a good way to get people to look at Scholarship Western, get people to write things on Wikipedia, and put links to Scholarship Western. So that's just a little thing to think about. Perhaps we are, in fact, focusing too much on, as I say, moving the old publication model from paper-based into an electronic base, but without really changing anything. You talk about old, I just want to address 1 or 2 things these guys said, and that's talk about early publications. In 1993, the first online law publication, which was pretty early, because that's really just when HTML really became available to the law folk, came out of the University of Western Australia, not us, God forbid. Western Australia. There's a law journal there that's been going online, peer-reviewed, good stuff, since 93. Since 97, quite a famous internet-y journal has been going from Sheffield and Warwick jointly. That's been going since 97. That's 12 years now. That's not bad going. So open access is not really a new concept. It's just something that we're trying to rethink in a digitally networked world. The software folk have been thinking about this since Stallman in '83 started jumping up and down and making sure people had access to source code so that they could do what they want with their materials, their tools. And there's open access people like Richard Jefferson, an American in Australia, who is making open access biology, for example, tools again, that people can use at an open access basis. So there's lots of different paths that people are approaching the same problem. And to get a good high-level picture is probably difficult. I think the main thing to suggest is really that we shouldn't really think about just replicating the old publishing pyramid model and shoving that in an electronic format. Thank you.
It looks as though we should have allowed more time, but it's better actually to stand only crowd or to run out of time than for the inverse. So we have about up to 15 minutes or so for questions, and then I want to make some remarks. So if questions to address to a particular speaker or throw it open to the panel because of the different perspectives. Question? You had a question before, I think. Anybody here will have a question? Yes, yeah.
Refer to alcohol and over 45.
Can you hear in the back, or should?
We have been disseminating our information. You're a scientist, you want to get the data out there. There's ways to do that. And one of the ways that we've been doing it is to go to conferences. And some of those conferences, unfortunately, some of the information is embargoed in the journal for some time, but those who attend, the delegates, all get access, immediate access. So if you haven't been to FASEB in the States, for example, we've got 30,000 people running around there, all with access to every one of their abstracts, all front of the line, brand new stuff for the most part. May or may not be able to find. And so our students need to know about that kind of stuff. And we've been doing it for a long time. You don't have to be over 45 to do that. But I was struck by our first presenter saying he spent $1,500.
That's in order to get that paper published by an open access journal, it gets accepted, yes. $1,500 US.
And some journals are starting to charge by page, and depending on how many tables you want and so on. And so you can actually do that. And students ask me and say, hey, if you're going to pay to have it published, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, so cost-benefit analysis has been done between open access and not open access, and the cost of publication at the end comes around the same. Either because you have to deal, like you said, with page charges and color figure charges, or administration charges sometimes, or because you have the open access fee, which charge you upfront if the paper gets accepted. So the cost at the end is pretty comparable. The second thing to keep in mind is that more and more we are putting publication costs within the grant applications, right? And so to be frank, I think that I mentioned in one of my slides, quickly in passing by, that I think that the last time we counted on that, less than 10% of all the costs of a publication actually come from private funds of the investigator. 95% of the time that comes from either the funding agency or some funding that the institution has aside for it.
Mark?
I just wanted to rebut the first thing you said. It's not exactly what I said. What I said was that people over 45 would remember, 20 years ago, that the norm was that labs shared resources. Now if you want to say I should share something, you should sign an NTA whenever you share stuff. Otherwise the university's going to be prosecuted.
Well,
Sign an NTA.
Yeah, material transfer. Send a sample out.
Okay.
I can tell you, as being involved in evaluating people for promotion and tenure in North America, and having come up now recently from multiple processes at different universities, that when people start to look at indicators of performance to finally decide for P&T, unfortunately participation in conferences is not ranked to the level of publications.
No.
So it is effectiveness. It is effectiveness. It is effective, maybe, but just participating in conferences in biological, medical sciences does not carry a weight to the promotion of the tenure.
Yeah, no, not right. Now, let me just take
I wonder if we could move on to another question. I see that this is a conversation that could go on and on and on. It's the whole question of the business case is still under review and that sort of thing, because there are costs involved. And the crisis you mentioned earlier, which was not a crisis, it was really quite chronic, had passed the cost on to the libraries. But the cost of actually producing that first copy of the article, there are real costs. And Western, we actually were one of the early Biomed Central institutions to pay to help defer the cost on the researcher. I saw, John, you had a question?
Is there any evidence that open access journals have put a brake on the commercial price increases that we've been experiencing in the past?
Do you want me to handle that? Well, if you have some opinion, go ahead. I have.
No opinion. I have experience in non-open access journals. Top-of-the-line journals continue to serve as they were before the open access. They have been accommodating in, downgrading the restrictions of what you can do with the paper once it is accepted. In other words, some of them have now a rather open access policy allowing you to post the pre-referencing version of the paper. In other words, it's the paper as accepted without correction, preprint, but not in the format it will appear in the journal. These publishing companies continue to have their own, I would say, plan regarding the cost recovery. Well, actually, from the perspective of a librarian and university librarian, we're paying how many millions of dollars a year for journals? I don't know, 8, 9 million or something for Western. It's an enormous amount of money. The rate of increase has mitigated. So the second differential is negative. So it's still increasing, but we're looking at single-digit inflation rather than double-digit inflation, which was the case from 85 to 95, which led to that amazing graph that Ajit referred to earlier. So, and some new journals that have been published under new schemes have actually put competitive journals out of business. But the really big publishers, the really big names, they're still going strong, but they're not getting as much of an increase year over year as they had in the past.
So it's kind of interject.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing crisis. It sort of started growing a little while back. Sort of still in the midst of it. But I mean, just make a quick comment about the cost issue or author pay. There are different types of funding models, right? And they're grant subsidizing the cost is one way, but the institution subsidizing, right? In terms of the journal that I was an editor for, Open Access. I was paid as an editor as a graduate student at the university, had the repository software, and it was free to access. It was not free to produce by any means, it was labor, but the platform itself was paid for the repository. And there are other models, like open journal systems that I talked about, where societies, where they're having troubles with various print runs can move electronically. In certain cases, libraries, there's a huge program called Synergies project where various libraries are serving as nodes in Canada to transition social science and humanities journals, which have been open access in the electronic format hasn't been caught on as strongly. It's trying to implement in that area where the authors may not actually produce these cost be reasonable for us.
I'm glad you mentioned the Synergies project, which is something we should all know about, which is a CFI-funded project, which is really exploring proof of concept in terms of the journal publishing system, but also the business case, the models for making them sustainable. So, your question, yes?
In Canada, certainly the strong dollar means that's why we've got such a low inflation rate for journals. Otherwise, it would be double-digit if we had.
No, because I'm talking double-digit and based on the original price, which in most cases is offshore, it's U.S. or European currency.
None of the panelists mentioned all the political implications of open access and the fact that in the UK, the commercial publishers have, and this was under Freedom of Information Act, they found that just before the UK voted on government involvement in open access, Elsevier and the other commercial publishers had a lot of time with politicians, a lot of lunches, a lot of suppers, and the open access group had something like 15 minutes to meet with the politician. And of course, the UK vote lost.
But people have the welcome trust, which is the number of private funders. They insist on calculation.
Well, it's a long journey, and it's actually been going on for decades as such. And I personally feel we've made a lot of progress. At one time was the librarians crying in the wilderness, you know, oh, woe is me, all the expensive journals. Now we have the faculty members, researchers, the scholars crying with us and actually making a difference. So Public Library of Science and Biomed Central and the ARL Spark Initiative, and Western Libraries is one of the founding members of Spark that started this movement. So there's a lot of exciting things happening. It hasn't quite gone viral yet, but it may. You were saying one of the speakers at ARL last week, Schulenberg, who used to be at the University of Kansas, has every confidence that this will be the way of the future. So it's because of the folks in this room, the researchers, those who believe. You believe realistically, which I think what we heard today is that, you know, you can believe in open access, but you have to understand the limitations and the circumstances and use it to your advantage. So, other comments, questions? Yes.
You mentioned about encouraging students to develop initiatives like this at Western. How would you recommend that students go about doing so?
Well, just the advocacy level. I mean, if students are aware of the issues and you know, they see the importance of open dissemination of research is one thing, but maybe on a certain very action-based agenda, student journals, for instance, creation of we have the repository software, we have journal software as part of it too. Yeah, I mean, there may be units that again, I don't know how your labor will be paid for. It might be labor of love at the beginning, but you know, nothing's free. But certainly students can develop, whether it's undergraduates, graduate students. And that's an initiative I was a part of as a graduate student. So that's one constructive way the tools are there to create open access platforms. But I think just to be aware of the issues, and when I talk, and I second the point of Mark, I mean, institutional support is important. Having the university administration's ear at a very high level on these issues is important. Look at the MIT example, where it's open access university. You know, librarians have been great leaders in this. I'm happy to be part, affiliated with this group, but I think ultimately the longer term, it has to be seen as an issue that's important at the top levels. There's only so much pushing you can do, but I think you can build up a groundswell by getting other interested actors involved, such as students. There's a real pressure.
The library has been working with a team of students to create a new online journal called Western Undergraduate Research Journal, Health and Natural Sciences. So now it's online. I mean, we are recruiting manuscripts, so we can talk more about that later.
But with the publishing platform that we have actually many journals that are created with using that publishing platform, including open access journals, and it's all a labor of love for the editors and the organizers, but it's possible to do. And if talk to Adrian and see what could happen in different subject areas, so that growth of enthusiasm and participation and that sort of thing. So,
just to add, made me think too about Mark's point also about, are we going to replicate the old model and put it into the new model? That's a very important question, because I've talked to some scholars and activists where the whole notion of peer review, people say, well, in the age of Wikipedia, and I'm not saying I'm going in this direction, but in a much more networked environment, interactive environment, Web 2.0 environment, who is your peer now? Can the public be peer reviewing, where you put research up? Okay, that's, I mean, again, there are some laughs, but certainly, you know, there's might be some limitations to that. But the point that Walensky is making, or is in his book, in my talk, that the social impact of open access research also goes beyond the academic community in the very sense that, especially in applied social sciences, when you talk about education research, policy research, citizens, right? We as citizens that we're, you know, the democratic idealist that we want to have, there's very esoteric language in a lot of academic work. There's a lot of academic work that has direct consequences for the decision in various ways. And if that's more available and activists can get a hold of it much easier, practitioners can get it easier, then there's a public good function.
well, I think there's some very provocative things that have been said today, and I think these conversations have to continue. But in the time that we have, just some wrap-up remarks, if you would fill in your evaluation form. I'm sure our speakers will be available for one-on-one following this. And just a reminder, there are some other events that are upcoming. On Thursday, October 22nd, from 9 to 9:50 in the Taylor Library. If you want to sit down and learn how to actually leverage open access to ensure that there's open access to your scholarship, there's a workshop on that. And on November 4th, there was a handout about a special talk on copyright and ensuring access for teaching and research. And if you want to read on an ongoing basis about scholarly communication and open access, check out Adrian's blog, which he's very faithfully keeping up and is actually quite internationally read. So I think there's a lot happening at Western. Our scholarship at Western, which is our new venture, which has multifaceted access points and opportunities, is there. I'm sorry we had to cut off the discussion, but I really appreciate all the thoughtful, provocative, and changing the system, creating change. That's what it's all about, challenging. So thank you very much.